Good afternoon. My name is Eva Feldman, and I'm director of the NeuroNetwork for Emerging Therapies. Today, we'll present to you a symposium on brain health and nutrition. A special thank you to Catherine and Robert Jacobs for sponsoring today's symposium, and to Patricia Muradian, CEO and president of the Henry Ford, who is partnering with us today for today's symposium. At the end of the symposium, which will constitute 3 talks, there will be a Q&A session. Please put your questions in the Q&A area, and we will also address those questions that were sent to us online. Now, the size of the obesity problem in the United States cannot be understated. We are the most obese country in the world. Now, obesity is calculated based on your body mass index, which is calculated based on your weight and height. A BMI of greater than 30 is considered obese. Note in Michigan, greater than 35% of adults are obese. Another 30% of our adults are overweight. And what's more alarming is that 19% of our youth are frankly obese. And with obesity comes what I'll call the usual suspects in terms of disease: cardiovascular disease, stroke, and diabetes. But today I'm going to discuss with you the not so usual suspects: cognitive decline, low IQ, and actual frank Alzheimer's disease. And we became interested in this because 10 years ago, there were a series of studies, and I'm showing you 4 here, which showed that midlife obesity clearly led to very early Alzheimer's disease. So we asked in our laboratory, well, why could that be? Could it be that the unhealthy foods that people eat when they become obese affect brain function differently than healthy foods which are eaten by people who are leaner? So to tackle that problem, we actually went to our basic science laboratory and looked at the mitochondria. This is the structure that is in each of your cells that produces energy. Each of us have billions of mitochondria, shown here in a photomicrograph. And so what we did is look at how lipids and sugars are used by the mitochondria to orchestrate energy, known as ATP. And here you see a nerve cell, and you see the long nerve or axon emanating from the nerve cell. So we examined how these nerve cells use energy. And in particularly, we looked at saturated or bad fats that are found in obesogenic or fatty foods versus unsaturated or good fats. And the difference between a bad and a good fat really lies in the fact that unsaturated fatty acids have this double bond, making them more liquid and freely mobile. And what we found in the nerve is that mitochondria can take unsaturated fatty acids and easily turn them into ATP or energy sources. However, when a nerve sees saturated fatty acids, what occurs is that the nerve cannot easily process these saturated fatty acids, and there's a buildup of bad energy, an energy crisis, and an accumulation of toxic waste. And so what occurs then is mitochondrial injury and cellular injury. When bad fats are processed, there's a loss of energy production with the accumulation of toxic waste products known as reactive oxygen species and tissue inflammation. We next asked in the laboratory, though, but why are nerves in the brain more susceptible? Well, it's because they need to orchestrate more energy demand. So if you look here at a skin cell, 25% of the volume of a skin cell is mitochondria, and it really only has to provide energy to, let's say, the hub of the traffic here. Well, in contrast, a nerve cell, 50% of a nerve cell volume is mitochondria, and it must provide traffic down these long highways or long nerve tracts. So to examine if trafficking of mitochondria was affected by bad fats, we again turned to the laboratory and looked at individual mitochondria in nerves. So here's a nerve cell, and we've now labeled the mitochondria with yellow, and we can watch them move and track down the nerves normally when they see good saturated fats. However, when bad fats or palmitate, which is a saturated fat, is found in the nerve, or we treat the nerves with palmitate, what you see is that their trafficking totally stops, while the good unsaturated fats like oleate, the nerves work beautifully. In parallel, what we find is that saturated fats like palmitate, again, found in lard, kill nerves. Here's 80% of nerves died when treated with saturated fat, while unsaturated fat, like oleate, found in olive oil, is very healthy for nerves. And here's an example of what a dead nerve cell looks like. So what does this mean to the brain? Well, when there's then energy failure and mitochondrial failure because the source of energy is bad fat, then these nerve cells can no longer speak to each other. They're no longer connected. The nerve cells die, and you have both tissue and volume loss as well as loss of connections. Now, here at Michigan Medicine, we actually are looking at cognition in clinically overweight and obese groups of patients. And what we have found in our clinical cohorts is that there's a clear cognitive decline that correlates with increased BMI. And it also particularly correlates with blood pressure, the levels of bad fat in your blood, along with an enlarged waist size. To better look at this, we've now gone to looking at structural changes with MRI. So you can do something called functional MRI, where a patient actually performs tasks in the scanner, and we can measure different aspects of brain function, again, in relationship to weight and the types of food that are being ingested. We can do arterial spin labeling, which actually looks at blood flow, both regionally and globally, dependent again on body weight and fat ingestion. And we can also look at all the connections in the brain. It's really fascinating. It's known as the connectome, where we're looking at how point A speaks to point B and if these tracks are connected, and understanding brain connections in terms of saturated fats and diet. So I've tried to tell you a little bit about the science behind you are what you eat, and that an unhealthy diet really does cause an unhealthy brain with the loss of brain cells, poor blood flow, and connection loss. We'll now hear from Dr. Debra Reid from the Henry Ford, who will tell us how we got here today with unhealthy diets, and then from our Michigan Medicine dietitian, Danielle Karsies, who will tell us how to be healthy and what contains a healthy diet and a healthy brain. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Feldman, for a fascinating overview of brain health and the science. My role is to help understand the sources of food over time and the changes that have occurred that help us understand how we've gotten to this point with our eating habits. And we're using resources from the Henry Ford in Dearborn, Michigan, to provide this overview. We often think of healthy food as those raised by farmers, handheld from start to finish. Farm families historically grew, processed, preserved, and consumed their own foods. And through public market sales, there was a direct relationship between growers and the urban consumers who could otherwise not grow their own. That doesn't mean that all these foods were healthy, and just because foods are fresh doesn't mean that they are going to support brain health. But current research obviously shows that there's a direct connection between the foods you eat and cognitive health. So that was something that some folks understood in the past. George Washington Carver, for example, here explains that gardens, he encouraged families to raise gardens, and that gardens furnished a great variety of food stuff, which is absolutely essential to good health and the proper strength of both mind and body. But not everyone was as committed to purity in foods, and therefore the full essence of foods as others, and processors were quite concerned about this. Heinz and Noble, eventually Heinz, and Borden Condensed Milk were two companies of many that stressed the purity of their products and labeled their products pure from the earliest time of their companies. Governments become involved in protecting consumer health by ensuring foods are pure. Michigan in 1895 passed a Pure Food and Drug Act, and perhaps most notable on the national level is the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which Theodore Roosevelt, their president at the time, advocated for, among many others. That 1895 act in Michigan led brewers in the city to label their beers pure without drugs or poison, as an example of product assurance for customers. Purity of foods also related to the health of the animals from which the foods came. Bovine tuberculosis and concerns about the transfer of that from cattle through milk to human consumers motivated extensive herd assessment and in fact some herd annihilation if a cattle tested positive for tuberculosis. So some of these efforts to ensure pure food, high quality foods for consumers had dire consequences for producers. So producers, consumers, and the government attempted to ensure the healthy food supplies historically. I think it's really important also to understand the ways that science factors into this. By 1906, science and scientists become the almost controllers of purity. If science deemed a food healthy, pure, then it was considered healthy. And the assurance of purity and nutritional health moved from the producer on their land to the laboratory, you could say. And the form, this most overt form of this, I would say, is the enrichment of foods so diseases could be prevented. And this bottle of milk provides a good example of adding vitamin D to milk, but there are also iodine added to salts to prevent goiter, vitamin C's added to foods to prevent scurvy, and then the most notable for many impoverished Americans was the enrichment of flour with niacin and vitamin B's added to prevent pellagra. But as science helped foods with enriched qualities and regulations to ensure purity, foods also become the product of the labs. So synthetic foodstuffs with this advertising sign for Pabst Et, which was the Pabst Brewing Company's prohibition answer to using certain products in new forms, and then ultimately as synthetic products as space sticks. Well, this has lasting consequences in many ways beyond the time we have today to talk, but we look at fast food today as a source of unhealthy food, but when you look at that hot dog on that bun, that's meat that could very well be processed in a totally non-adulterated way and be perceived as safe on a bun made of niacin-enriched flour. So what's unhealthy about it? Add to that the fact that starting during the 30s, there's an increased effort on the part of processors to produce products that increasingly multitasking women especially are doing to ensure that they can still feed their families. So you have amazing shortcuts and new types of drink products. And ultimately, things like frozen dinners, heavily processed with lots of additives, both preservatives and flavorings. And the combinations of these for an increasingly multitasking society lead to some unhealthy eating habits. So at the Henry Ford and Greenfield Village especially, and living history farms across the country, you can actually, as a visitor or as a staff, get direct knowledge about where does food come from. So green plants in the 1750s, heirloom varieties featured at the Daggett farmstead, and corn raised in the garden, in this case, heritage varieties of sweet corn at the Ford home, 1870s, Dearborn. Susquehanna, 1860s, Maryland, field corn. Maddox House, early 30s, house garden, or what sometimes you call a kitchen garden, the basis for this family's health at the time. And then the magnificent living history farm at Greenfield Village, Firestone Farm, where animals and plants help guests, 600,000 of them a year, learn about the ways that farm families fed themselves. the Greenfield Village is currently involved in a major restoration process of the vegetable building from Central Market in Detroit. And this will allow us to focus on the public grower engagement in the late 19th century. And through the generosity of donors, the Carver Carson Society is funding this project and a larger effort on edible education. So this is a huge topic with many moving parts, but to summarize, we think of food as healthy if we know the grower, we know farm families are raising, processing, preserving, and consuming their own foods, and folks are directly buying from market gardeners. But the government and science have both been heavily involved in food health, purity, and the definitions of healthy foods. So I'm looking forward to learning more from Danielle Karsies about how these foods directly relate to brain health, how we can in fact be better consumers of our foods to protect our minds as well as our bodies. Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah, for sharing that information. Now that we have a better understanding of the reason why our diets have changed over time and some of the research behind obesity and fat's impact on cognition and the nervous system, we will end the symposium today with how a healthy diet can significantly benefit our brain's health. The gut-brain axis is the perfect place to start, as it's a huge part of why our diet is so important for brain health. As Dr. Reid showed, our diets have evolved towards highly processed, low nutrient and fiber-containing foods, which has caused imbalances in the gut bacteria that change neurotransmitter function and alter immune response. So a poorly nourished microbiome will not function as well. To date, neurological disorders such as ALS, MS, Parkinson's, and Alzheimer's disease have shown alterations in the gut microbiota. Plus, 95% of serotonin, a neurotransmitter that helps regulate mood, is produced in the GI tract. Additionally, the intestinal microbiota help produce the supply of vitamins that are important for brain health, such as vitamin B12, B6, B3, B5, folate, vitamin D, vitamin K, and they can also reduce the rate of neuron loss. Even temporary changes in the microbiota, such as antibiotic use, might actually affect memory, learning, and anxiety. To support the strong gut-brain axis, we want to eat a diet rich in dietary fiber and probiotics, which may improve cognitive function. Probiotics may additionally help boost mood, lower stress, inflammation, and anxiety. So the bottom line is that the diet modulates the GI microbiome, and eating a diet rich in different types and sources of fiber and probiotics will help support a diverse microbiome. As stated earlier, a healthy gut microbiome helps produce vitamins, and the brain is an organ dependent on a constant supply of nutrients. Specific nutrients act as spark plugs in neurobiological pathways, performing vital functions for the brain. In general, dietary deficiencies are associated with higher incidence of mood disorders. Some important nutrients for the brain include the zinc and magnesium for NMDA receptor signaling, as well as folate and the B vitamins that we talked about earlier, which are cofactors for the synthesis of neurotransmitters. And low levels of vitamin D can negatively affect cognition, overall brain volume, and hinder neuronal levels of calcium, leading to depression. I am often asked, what supplements should I take? While supplementation of these nutrients might be recommended in people who are deficient and not able to meet repletion needs from diet alone, it would not be the best way to support your brain health. A healthy diet that includes foods that are naturally rich in these nutrients will also provide the fiber, healthy fats, and other beneficial nutraceuticals your brain needs for best functionality. So diet over supplements is always my recommendation. Dr. Feldman reviewed the role of healthy fats as energy powerhouses and how they minimize oxidative stress and inflammation. So we know that research shows low levels of systemic inflammation can play a role in mental health disorders, cognitive decline, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and multiple sclerosis. Plus, more than 50% of the brain membrane is composed of fatty acids. So a diet rich in healthy fats, the monounsaturated, polyunsaturated fats, including EPA and DHA, help support a healthy brain and additionally ensure the best blood flow to the brain by lowering the triglycerides and reducing blood. Beyond fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, and seeds giving us fiber and vitamins for overall brain health, they additionally contain phytochemicals. These phytochemicals, called polyphenols, may increase cerebral blood volume, decrease inflammation, as well as act to reduce oxidative stress, contributing to neurodegeneration and depression. Here you can see the different types of polyphenols, the flavonoids, the phenolic acids, the polyphenolic amides, as well as where you can find them, the fruits, the vegetables, the whole grains, the nuts, and the seeds that we've already learned are beneficial for us. Insulin signaling is essential for brain health, so high blood glucose levels and insulin resistance would hinder optimal brain function. Elevated blood glucose levels specifically contribute to oxidative stress and damage to cells that induce inflammation, as well as increase the risk of vascular dementia and cognitive decline in pre-diabetics. So carbohydrate-controlled diet focused on whole grains and avoidance of refined grains may reduce the incidence of cognitive impairment. Moving on to recommended diet patterns for specific cognitive diseases, a 2017 meta-analysis on diet patterns and depression showed that there was a decreased risk of depression with the foods we've already talked about, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, healthy fats, and low-fat dairy, and an increased risk of depression with high intakes of red and processed meats, refined grains, full-fat dairy, and potatoes. The SMILE trial, or the Supporting the Modification of Lifestyle and Lowered Emotional States, found similar findings with the modified Mediterranean diet, which did allow for some consumption of red meat and dairy products. The MIND diet, or the Mediterranean DASH intervention for neurodegenerative delay, combines two heart-healthy diet plans, the DASH and the Mediterranean diet, to optimize brain health. They include recommendations for how often you should eat foods, with daily recommendations for your green leafy vegetables, nuts, olive oil, and wine, with several servings of whole grain, as well as hopefully more vegetables on a daily basis. Every other day, including at least some beans, berries, and poultry, and fish at least once a week, but of course more often could be acceptable. Limiting the foods that we know have those saturated fats that are gonna inhibit that mitochondrial pathway that Dr. Feldman talked about, your red meats, your margarines and butters, your cheese, your refined grains, as well as high fats in the pastries, sweets, and fast foods. So to sum it up, for overall brain health, these last few slides will review what to include more of, what to limit, and how to do this with simple plate method of meal planning. If you're thinking of your plate, try and make 2/3 to 3/4 of the meal dedicated to your fruits, your vegetables, and your whole grains. These nutrient-rich foods are gonna help with good cognition, and the fiber will help with that healthy GI tract. Healthy fats, which Dr. Feldman talked about to decrease inflammation and optimize that blood flow, includes your nuts, your seeds, your fatty fishes, as well as avocado and cooking with olive oil and canola oil instead of your butter. Including calcium-rich foods to lower blood pressure to optimize the blood flow to the brain, focusing on the leafy greens and the beans, but including low-fat dairy as well in small portions. And focusing on good hydration, because dehydration can cause brain cells to shrink in size, affecting memory and concentration. When we're talking about what to limit, since fat releases inflammatory proteins called cytokines, causing inflammation that decrease blood flow, we want to limit these saturated and trans fats. We can do this by choosing the lean proteins, avoiding butter and using more olive oil and canola, choosing low fat and fat-free dairy products, as well as limiting the egg yolks and focusing more on the egg whites where the protein is. Limiting the overall sodium content to keep our blood pressure within good range. Limiting alcohol intake, no more than 2 drinks per day for men, 1 drink for women, or less often is perfectly fine as well. When we're talking about limiting added sugar, this is to optimize our insulin signaling. And for limiting portions, we want to do this for weight management, as individuals with larger waist to hip ratios, which is a sign of unhealthy visceral fat, had poorer mental sharpness. We'll move on to the next slide to talk about these different portions. When we're talking about the portions, we want a good quarter of our plate to be our protein-rich foods. Those protein-rich foods should be more plant-based, more whole grains, beans, nuts, legumes, with a smattering of poultry and fish and occasional use of red meats as desired, but more sparingly. We want to include whole grains as much as possible because that's where we're going to get those nutrient powerhouses. But 2/3 of the time, at least, choosing whole grain. 1/3 of the time, if you're doing white rice or you're having white pasta when you're out at a gathering or a restaurant, that would be fine. Including half of your plate being fruits, vegetables, so that you're getting those nutrient-rich foods, as well as helping with calorie control, preventing weight gain or addressing the obesity factor. And then having a smattering of the healthy fats in your diet to help with the weight maintenance if you are at a healthy weight, and using them a little bit more sparingly if you're focusing on weight loss efforts. So that concludes our discussion today. We'll open it up to questions and hopefully address anything that we might not have already taken care of in our presentation.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Debra, and thank you, Danielle. We have 11 questions in the Q&A, and we also received 63 questions online. So I'll start with some online questions that kind of coalesce one with another. And let's start with you, Danielle. There are several questions about hormones, hormone ingestion, hormone fluctuations, and diet. So maybe you could just address the whole biology or area, a bit of hormones and diet.
Sure. So a diet that's poor, or a poor diet, can lead to chronic inflammation. And we know that inflammation can elevate hormones, one being cortisol. So if we focus just on that cortisol, elevated levels of cortisol can increase the risk of diabetes, contribute to weight gain, as well as compromise the digestion and absorption of the nutrients that we need for brain health. So hormones play a significant role. The other part is insulin itself in our blood glucose control is a hormone. Insulin and insulin-like growth factor have inflammatory processes that go along with it. So higher carb diets can have a inflammatory process on the body. So there's lots of ways where hormones can play into how our body's functioning, and we want to eat a healthy diet that's going to decrease the inflammation and optimize our brain health.
Excellent. Thank you. So Debra, to you, there is a new exhibit at the Henry Ford entitled Food Soldiers, Nutrition and Race Activism. Could you describe in a few sentences what this is about?
Yes, we do special pop-ups, small single case exhibits featuring, well, for Black History Month, this began, it's continuing through March, which is National Nutrition Month, and it focuses on the role of Black women who train, mostly women, but not exclusively, who trained as nutritionists, overcoming racism and still working within a gendered society, but to address the consequences of racism to ill health, including not least of which is added stress, but also food insecurity. I saw a question about food insecurity, and the ability to get enough calories and to secure enough healthy food was often not possible for poor, rural, impoverished, Southern especially, but also Northern people of color. And so Black nutritionists worked across the nation addressing these issues. You can find the blog if you look at the Henry Ford Food Soldiers.
Excellent. I guess I'll take the question. There's several questions on artificial sweeteners and additives, but particularly are artificial sweeteners good for you? Are they bad for you? Which ones you should or should not have? So it's very, and comparing them to sugar, several questions on sugar. So there's clearly, there are multiple artificial sweeteners, and clearly there's sugar. So when you ingest either sugar or an artificial sweetener that tastes sweet, you actually have a reward circuit in your brain that's mediated by dopamine that says, "Ooh, I like that." Okay, and so that's common for everyone. But if you're eating sugar, then you also have insulin production, as Danielle has spoken to, and that also triggers a satiety center that says, "Oh, but I'm full, I've had enough." But if you're having a sweetener, an artificial sweetener, it's not going to trigger insulin, so there's no satiety, so you are continuously hungry. So actually, artificial sweeteners clearly increase appetite. And they've been shown to be associated with both weight gain and with type 2 diabetes. And interestingly, artificial sweeteners actually change the gut microbiota that Danielle was speaking about and actually increase your insulin resistance. Now, there are some plant-based sweeteners. The most common is stevia from the stevia plant. And what's shown is when you have the plant-based artificial sweeteners, you still have that increase in your hunger because your satiety has not been dampened down. So you still want to eat a lot, so you would have weight gain, but it does not appear to affect your gut microbiota. Okay, so onward. Danielle, you're next.
All right.
Couple of questions, maybe 3 or 4 about a completely plant-based diet, so a vegetarian and a vegan, and is that healthy? And how would you blend that with the MIND diet?
Sure. So in general, a diet that has a plant-based focus, 2/3 to 3/4 of your plate is plant-based, whether it includes some lean animal products or whether it includes no animal products at all, they seem to have the same beneficial effect because you're still getting all of the good nutrients that you need from a brain health standpoint, and you're limiting the things that we know can be detrimental in large portion sizes, such as high amounts of red meats or the saturated fats. So whether or not you want to be totally vegan or whether you want to have a smattering of these animal-based products in your diet, the key is getting that plant-based focus, 2/3, 3/4 of your plate, plant-based to optimize that nutrition, optimize the gut health. And the one thing with the vegan diet that you wouldn't necessarily get would be your B12. So we talked about B12 during the presentation, that can be important for brain health, those neurotransmitters. And so making sure that you are supplementing if you are following a vegan diet, get that extra B12 in.
Excellent. So there are also several questions, and I would like to tell the audience, we looked at the questions ahead of time and tried to address some of them in our presentations, but many questions on kind of what foods one should eat to keep optimal brain health, particularly in terms of fats. And I will just briefly address this again. I think Danielle has made it very clear that foods high in saturated fat actually are poorly processed by are rapidly processed by the brain, but produce a great deal of toxic waste and actually reactive oxygen species and inflammation. So you want to have fats that are good fats, as Danielle has said. So, your fish, your nuts, olive oil, avocados. So that really does need to be kind of the ongoing mantra. I think that a next question, and I'll throw one to Danielle, is I would like to hear about grains, pasta, and any convenient foods that are nutrient rich that you think we could eat as a family.
Sure. So in general, I know carbohydrates tend to get picked on. Our whole grains, if we're looking at the ones that are 100% whole grain, they came out of the ground the way that they were intended. They have a low glycemic index and they're high in nutrient content. Not only do they have fiber, but they've actually got protein content to it as well. So things that are corn, brown rice, whole wheat, oats, barley, quinoa, those are all great whole grains, and there's more beyond that. The key with these is some of them do come in microwavable single-serve containers, so we can use them from a convenience standpoint to add to some stir-fried vegetables that we might have for dinner. If we're using whole grain breads, we can make healthy sandwiches with hummus, nut butter, or avocado kind of spread on it, and then adding fruits or vegetables, depending on what would go best with it, probably more fruit with the nut butter than a vegetable. And then your whole wheat pastas or quinoa, those convenient microwavable versions, if you could easily saute up some frozen mixed vegetables, that would be minimal prep work, and have a light sauce in there, some garlic, some olive oil, some seasonings, very quick meals that would give you great nutrition.
Excellent. I'll take one here on what foods can boost your metabolism and your brain health again. And so it's interesting, and there are several, again, questions on this line where, are there foods you can eat that can boost or increase your metabolism? Well, so it takes a lot more energy, if you're talking about energy use and caloric use, to actually metabolize protein. So it takes about 15 to 30% more actual energy to metabolize proteins. Second in line would be metabolizing carbohydrates. That takes about 5 to 10% energy. And as I showed you, and the reason a lot of our research is right now focused on fats, our fats are most easily metabolized, and they take very little energy, about 1%. So if you want to eat foods that would boost your metabolism and actually needs more energy to be metabolized and used as a source of energy in your body, it would be to eat a higher protein diet, a higher protein content. Okay, I think maybe Danielle and I will each take one more question, and we'll go to the chat now. And then I will do a couple concluding remarks. And I think Danielle might have some interesting information also in terms of what can be offered in terms of nutrition at Michigan. So Danielle, we have 13 questions in the chat, and maybe I will ask you to comment on one. Are lean organic red meats, because this was also in our other questions, from sources such as deer, better than red meat from farm-raised hogs and cattle?
So our meats that are free-range meats do tend to have a different kind of fat ratio to the meats. Deer, bison, venison, things along those, I guess venison and deer are the same, but those wild game tend to have different fat compositions. Same thing with organically grown. When they get different feed products, they actually have different nutrient products in there. So overall, red meat in general, it's more the heme iron, not necessarily just the saturated fat content, but the heme iron content of those red meats. And venison falls into that category. Lamb, your beef products would all be in that red meat category. And actually pork is too. It just has a lower heme iron content to it. All of those, too much of that heme iron can be damaging to the lining of the GI tract. So there's a risk of colorectal cancer. I'm not sure if that heme iron is what plays into why red meat is discouraged when we're talking about brain health in general, or whether it's just the saturated fat content of it. In general, the lean proteins, if you're doing the venison, I think is a reasonable portion to include, but I do try and tell people that it's portion amount. So I usually say 3 servings of about 3 to 4 ounces per week, I think is a reasonable amount to include without being excessive in.
Did you want to mention, Danielle, before I take the last question, about the nutrition classes that are available at Michigan Medicine?
Sure. So it sounds like there were a lot of questions on this, both prior to the talk as well as in the chat, that are related to nutrition. And we have some really good, we have about 40 virtual group nutrition classes that are going on and will be going on continuously that can give you more information. Some focus on, mood and health and nutrition and health. Some focus on, specific diseases. Some focus on diabetes or just healthy eating. So if you're interested in that, I believe we're going to be trying to send a link out with the wrap up that you can get access to that, whether you're a Michigan Medicine patient or outside of. You just need to register get a registration number to be able to attend.
Yes, and yes, I think that will be very informative for many people on the chat and on our symposium today. And I think I'll take the last question, because again, it's both in the Q&A and it was in our submitted questions, and that's a little bit about toxins and pesticides in food. So we clearly know, and is it good or bad for the brain? Well, we clearly know the pesticides, persistent organic pollutants that come from plasticizers, PFAS, for example, which is high content in our water. These are all actually quite bad for the brain. And it's been shown that they are clearly increased and help advance Alzheimer's and cognitive decline earlier. And it's also been shown they've been linked to other neurodegenerative diseases, such as Lou Gehrig's disease, something that we've actually done a lot of work on. So you do want to, as much as possible, use foods that have not been treated with pesticides. So we do prefer and do suggest organic foods. when, of course, I would say your body allows it as much as possible. And then I think it is important to look at the metal content in fish, particularly mercury. That's very important. And there are what's known as the clean foods and the unclean foods. And there are 12 foods that are listed as having the highest pesticide content. And I will send that link out when we send the summary of today's talk. So I'd like to conclude with a couple of first thank yous again to Robert and Catherine Jacobs, and also to Patricia Meridian from the Henry Ford, and of course, Dr. Debra Reid from the Henry Ford for joining us today. For Danielle Karsies, our Michigan medicine nutritionist, and for all of you for attending. We will be sending out the following, the main bullet points from today's symposium, along with a link to the entire symposium, and you will receive that in approximately 10 days. I'm also going to add a link to some other answers to some of the key questions, such as clean foods, what foods are best for depression and for mood. There's a whole field that's called now nutritional psychiatry. And I'll send you a few links too for some just key bullet points on what you can eat, as Danielle has said, that can help elevate mood, especially during this, what's been a rather difficult year. And finally, for those individuals who have asked very specific disease questions, such as ALS, MS, Parkinson's, that I've received, I will personally answer each of you, but I didn't feel we had time to do it in our short symposium today. So all disease-specific questions will be answered personally by me. Thank you so much for attending, and we look forward to hearing from you. And I hope you'll read our newsletter with the bullet points in it concerning today. Goodbye.